Have you ever wondered what it'd be like if you could go back in time and to live through the Revolutionary War and just see what it'd be like in those early colonial days and in the early days of the making of America? Then you might like today's book, The Year of Living Constitutionally by A.J. Jacobs. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we are looking at a book that just came out a few months ago by A.J. Jacobs, The Year of Living Constitutionally. This is an interesting read for really anyone that has any interest in the colonial days, the ideas of what the founding fathers thought, and of course, what it means to apply the Constitution currently in our lives. For those of you who don't know, A.J. Jacobs is famous for his approach to journalism in which he really embeds himself into a story. He's done it on a bunch of different things, but probably his two most famous examples would be this book that just came out, and then a few years ago he had a book called The Year of Living Biblically, where he did a similar approach to what he did for this one, except instead of using the Constitution as his guide, he actually used the Bible, and he tried to live up to every commandment, every law, everything that is mentioned in the Bible. He tried to do in a year, and so he tried to do a similar thing when it came to the Constitution. Now, that doesn't only apply to the Constitution itself and what's written in it, but he also tried to put himself back into the time period. Now, he had a few ways of doing that. He did lots of research. He also tried to live his life in a similar fashion that people would have lived in the late 18th century. He is going to dress appropriately. He is going to not only wear clothes that look like stuff from the 18th century, he is going to try and get stuff that would be made from the correct fabric and is going to be made using the same processes, and he's going to try and make some things himself. And at one point he is even going to find himself walking around Manhattan with a musket because he is trying to be as authentic as possible at time period. When he writes letters, he does it with a quill and old loose ink, and so he is just trying to do everything he can to connect to the past. And he is obviously doing this for two reasons. One, because it provides some funny stories. I mean, most of what he does that tries to put him in touch with the past really does not dramatically change much, especially about his understanding of what the Constitution means and how we should interpret it. But he does say there are a few things that surprise him. So two big examples that he gives. First of all, he actually says that writing with quill changes the way he thinks about things because it slowed down how he wrote and it gave him a more thoughtfulness to the way he wrote as opposed to just typing out an email as quick as possible. So that was one thing that he said. And another example that he gave, and is actually how he started his year of living constitutionally, and that's that he went and found old election day recipes. People used to bake election day cakes, and so he found an authentic one. And he made it, and on election day, he went and he gave people, especially the poll workers, he gave them this election day cake. On top of that, he encouraged other people to then do a similar thing. And at its face value, this might just seem kind of silly trying to bring up an old recipe, but really what he was trying to do was to dig into what were the sentiments, what were the values, and what was the communal approach to the ideas in the Constitution, including how people conducted elections. And so that's why he found himself baking this election day cake. Of course, that's not all. He does all sorts of things. He's going to discover that it takes a lot longer to put his clothes on when he is wearing old-fashioned clothes. He said that there's many a time savers that we don't even think about nowadays, let alone the most obvious ones that would come to your mind when it comes to electricity, appliances, and cars. So walking everywhere and all of that, it's going to take much more time than you or I would probably want to invest right now in something like this, but it's something that contributed to the story that he is trying to tell. He also engages with the reenactment community, and that's something that he finds fascinating in and of itself, but he also discovers how much difference of opinion there is within the reenactment community. You have all sorts of people that have, very strict adherences to the way that they go and they do these reenactments. Some, of course, shun any type of technology that would not have been appropriate to the time. Some people, they go and they enjoy the day, but they, maybe still have their cell phone turned on the side or something like that, where they're not fully willing to detach from the modern world. But he gets these differences of opinion and he finds it really fascinating. However, at the heart of the book is his efforts at trying to understand ways we should interpret the Constitution. So he finds himself doing a lot of research, reading a lot of other books, having a lot of meetings with lawyers, constitutional scholars. He even meets with some congressmen. He may have met with the senator, I'm not sure. He proposes an amendment that I don't think it'll go anywhere. There's thousands of amendments that get proposed that never go anywhere, but he wanted to actually engage in that process. Probably the funniest thing that he does is he does discover that it is written in the Constitution. I don't remember which article, but it is written in the Constitution that Congress does have the right to essentially give people the privilege of being a pirate. I forget exactly the term. I'd have to look it up, but he discovers this and he thinks it's so fascinating that he goes and he asks a congressman if he could get that right, although Congress has not given that to anyone since 1815, but he still tries because he really wants to be as authentic as possible, and he felt like that was a good approach to it. So that's what this is. It's a combination of story after story of what it was like for him to try and live constitutionally, or more authentically, to live colonially. So trying to, dress appropriately and trying to do away with the labor-saving devices that we now have. There's that part of it, and it gives all these fun little stories that are interesting because A.J. Jacobs is a really engaging author. And then it is intermixed with all these questions of how should we actually look at the document, the Constitution, and how should we look at, the amendments and the way people have interpreted it, not just historically, but currently, because this is obviously an ongoing question. And there's a lot of thoughts about originalists or people that wouldn't consider themselves originalists. But even within the originalist community, you have a lot of different opinions of what exactly that means. I think originalists are usually associated with the more conservative Supreme Court justices, yet the most recent Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Jackson Brown, she called herself an originalist in her hearings. So it shows that there's clearly a lot of difference of opinion, a lot of difference of understanding and what even that means, let alone being some kind of conservative or liberal divide. So who would I say this book is for? Well, it's entertaining. If you want an entertaining look at what is a real question that a lot of people are frequently finding themselves contemplating, especially at a time like this when we are in the depths of yet another election season, and I feel like in recent years, we're constantly talking about elections. I think it's a good question to explore and to ask ourselves about what we might think about the Constitution. And even though his approach is clearly meant to be humorous, I think he gives some good insight, not just from what he personally did to connect with the Constitution, but also the research he did, the people he talked to, and to be honest and candid about his approach. I would say A.J. Jacobs, very much based off of what he writes and just, his background, he has a pretty liberal outlook on how the government should be run and how you should understand the Constitution. That being said, I think he gives a fair shake to trying to understand other people's perspectives. And so if you are willing to accept that element of the way he's writing and his approach, I very much think that you will enjoy it. Who do I not think this book is for? Well, I think that if you're looking for a really in-depth study of the Constitution, you're not really going to find this here. Not to say that what he has isn't a good study. I think he has a lot of great things to say. It's just that any one of those amendments you could write an entire book of. And so it has to, by its nature, be relatively short. But I think that he does a great job with what he does take a look at. Also, like I already said, I think his politics are pretty obvious. And so if that's going to be a problem for you, then this also may not be for you. But I would love to hear what other people have to say about this book. I do think that he does his best to deal with some pretty controversial issues, but at the same time, he is trying to be lighthearted, especially when it comes to telling the anecdotes. But let me know in the comments what you think. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. And until next time, keep those pages turning.